The silence that followed the child's words was a thing of substance, heavier and more suffocating than the dust that hung in the air. The snickers and whispers that had been Maggie's tormentors moments before died in the throats of the townsfolk, replaced by a collective, slack-jawed astonishment. Eyes shifted from Maggie's worn, travel-stained dress to the little girl, and then to the man who now moved through the crowd toward her. He was not a man who walked so much as one who partitioned the air and passed through the space he had made, tall and broad in the shoulders. He seemed carved from the same unforgiving landscape that surrounded them. His face was sun-cured leather, mapped with lines that spoke of squinting into the sun and holding his tongue. A thick, dark mustache hid the set of his mouth, but there was no softness in his eyes. They were the color of slate, hard and cool, and they were fixed on the small girl who stood with her finger still pointed at Maggie. "Ellie!" The man's voice was low, a gravelly sound that carried no more warmth than his gaze. "What did I tell you about wandering off?" The child, Ellie, finally lowered her arm, but her eyes, wide and blue as a patch of winter sky, never left Maggie's face. She seemed to pay her father no mind. "It's her, Papa, the one from my dream. It's Mama." A fresh wave of murmurs rippled through the onlookers. This was better than a new bride. This was a spectacle. The carpenter's girl, touched in the head since her mother passed, claiming a stranger, an old mail-order bride no one wanted. The man, Jonah Kane as Maggie would learn he was called, reached his daughter and placed a heavy, calloused hand on her shoulder. The gesture was meant to be steadying, a silent command, but the girl did not yield. "That's enough. Ellie," he said, his voice dropping even lower. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod in Maggie's direction. It was not an apology. Not quite. It was an acknowledgement of a nuisance, like a stone in his boot. He met Maggie's eyes for a brief, searing moment. In them, she saw a weariness so profound it seemed to have settled in his bones. He was a man walled off from the world, and his daughter had just thrown a rock clean through his defenses. He began to steer Ellie away, but the child planted her small feet in the dust. "No, we can't leave her. She's come all this way." "She's not your mother," Jonah said. The words clipped and final. He spoke them to his daughter, but they were aimed at the entire town. A flat denial intended to end the scene. For Maggie, shame was a tide, receding and then crashing back with renewed force. To be left at the station was one thing. To be the object of a child's fantasy and a town's pity was another. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, dissecting her, judging the gray strands at her temples, the lines fanning from her eyes, the simple fact of her unchosen existence. She pulled her shawl tighter, a useless gesture of self-preservation, and turned away from the station. She had to find a room. She had to find some small, private space where she could breathe again. Her steps were stiff. Her back held unnaturally straight as she walked toward the Dry Creek Hotel, which was really more of a boarding house with a saloon attached. The sign creaked in the rising wind, a wind that was starting to pick up a fine, stinging grit from the desert floor. It bit at her exposed skin, a fitting welcome to this desolate place. The man behind the hotel desk had a stained vest and an indifferent expression. He was polishing a glass with a rag that had seen better days. "I need a room," Maggie said, her voice sounding thin and foreign to her own ears. He glanced up, his eyes taking in her worn valise, her unadorned dress, and the absence of a man beside her. His gaze lingered for a moment, and a flicker of recognition crossed his face. He'd been at the station. He knew who she was. "Just for yourself?" he asked, though the answer was plain. "Yes." He set the glass down with a deliberate click. "Sorry, ma'am. All full up." Maggie looked past him at the wall of keys. More than half of them were hanging on their hooks. The lie was as plain as the dust on the floorboards. "I can see you have rooms available." The man sighed, a put-upon sound. "Look, lady, we don't rent to unescorted women. Causes trouble." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. A woman on her own. Folks get ideas, not the kind of establishment I'm running. The insult was a cold knot in her stomach. Back east, a war widow, a former nurse, had a certain measure of respect. Here, she was just trouble, a commodity without an owner. "I am hardly looking for trouble," she said, her voice tight with restraint. "I am simply looking for a place to sleep." "Can't help you," he said, turning his attention back to his glasses. The matter closed. Defeated. Maggie turned and pushed her way back out the swinging doors into the wind. The sky was no longer blue. It had taken on a sickly yellow-brown hue, and the sun was a hazy, indistinct smear behind a veil of dust. The wind howled now, a low, mournful sound that seemed to be scouring the very soul from the land. It whipped her skirts around her legs and forced her to shield her eyes with her hand. The town was emptying, people hurrying indoors, latching shutters, preparing for the blow. She was alone again, more profoundly alone than she had been on the train platform. She stood in the middle of the street, a solitary figure against the approaching storm, with nowhere to go. Her money was thin, her prospects thinner. The promises in Thomas Reed's letters had turned to ash in her mouth. It was then that a small hand slipped into hers. Maggie started, looking down into the earnest, upturned face of the little girl. Ellie. The child's hair was a wild tangle in the wind, and her cheeks were red from the stinging sand. Beside her stood Jonah Kane, his hat pulled low, his duster collar turned up against the gale. He looked even harder and more unyielding out here in the elements. "Papa, she's cold," Ellie said, her voice raised to be heard over the wind. She squeezed Maggie's hand with a surprising strength. "She can stay with us." Jonah Kane did not look at Maggie. He looked at the churning, dust-filled sky, then at the boards of the hotel porch, then at a loose horseshoe lying in the street. He looked anywhere but at the woman his daughter was clinging to. The muscle in his jaw worked, a small, hard knot of resistance. "This ain't your concern, Ellie," he said, his voice rough. "She's got no place to go," the girl insisted, her own voice taking on a note of desperation. "The storm's coming. You always say we help folks in a storm." Maggie tried to pull her hand away. "Thank you, child, but your father is right. I'll be fine." The words were a lie, and they both knew it. Jonah finally let his gaze fall on her. It was heavy, assessing. He was a carpenter, and he looked at her the way he might look at a piece of warped timber, weighing its flaws, its potential uses, its inherent troubles. He saw her worn boots, the set of her jaw, the exhaustion that she could no longer hide, and he saw his daughter, who refused to let go of her hand. With a sigh that seemed to be dragged up from the very depths of his being, he gave another one of his curt nods. It was not an invitation, it was a surrender. "The storm will be bad," he grated out. "You can shelter with us till it passes." He turned without waiting for a reply and began walking, his long strides eating up the ground. Ellie beamed, a triumphant, gap-toothed smile, and tugged Maggie along. "Come on," she urged. "Our house is warm." Maggie had no choice but to follow, her valise banging against her leg, the wind pushing at her back like a physical force. They left the main street and walked toward a small, sturdy-looking house at the edge of town. It was plain, unpainted, but the lines were true and the joints were clean. A carpenter's house. Piles of fresh-smelling lumber were neatly stacked to one side, covered by a tarp that flapped and snapped in the wind. The air was thick with the scent of pine resin and sawdust, a clean, earthy smell that was a welcome respite from the town's dust and despair. Jonah pushed the door open, and they practically fell inside, slamming it shut against the roaring wind. The sound of the storm was instantly muffled, reduced to a low, insistent howl. The inside of the house was one large room, spare and meticulously ordered. A cast-iron stove radiated a steady warmth. A large, well-scrubbed wooden table stood in the center with 2 chairs. In one corner was a bed. neatly made, and in the other, a small cot. Tools hung in precise arrangements on one wall, and the floor was swept clean. It was a space stripped of all but the essentials, a testament to a life of function over comfort. It was the house of a man who lived alone, except for a child's small rocking horse tucked away near the hearth. The silence inside was as tense as the wind outside. Jonah moved to the stove, his back to them, and added a piece of wood. Ellie, however, acted as if this were the most natural thing in the world. "You can put your bag there," she said, pointing to the cot. "That's my bed, but Papa says guests get the best place." Maggie hesitated, feeling like an intruder in this Spartan sanctuary. "I couldn't possibly—" "You'll take the cot," Jonah said without turning around. His tone brooked no argument. It was a statement of fact, not an offer of hospitality. Maggie placed her valise on the floor beside the small bed. She stood awkwardly in the middle of the room, unsure of what to do with her hands. The room was filled with the presence of the man who owned it. It was in the solid set of the table, the sharp edge of the chisels on the wall, the profound and lonely quiet. It was a quiet born of habit, and she had just broken it. He finally turned, his face illuminated by the flickering light from the stove's grate. "Storm will pass by morning," he stated. "Then you can be on your way." "Thank you, Mr. Kane," Maggie said formally. "I am in your debt." He gave a slight shake of his head, a dismissal of her gratitude. "My daughter insisted. I don't abide a child's foolish notions, but I won't have a woman freezing in the street, either." His gaze was direct, and in it, Maggie understood her position perfectly. She was not a guest. She was an obligation, an object of charity he had been forced to accept, a problem to be dealt with and then dispensed with at the earliest opportunity. They were strangers, bound for a few hours by a child's conviction and a gathering storm. But as she looked from the hard, withdrawn man to the bright, hopeful child, Maggie felt the first, faint stirring of something other than humiliation. She saw in him a loneliness that mirrored her own, a fortress built to keep the world out, and she realized, with a strange and unsettling certainty, that his daughter had just invited the world right back in. Outside, the sand scourged the wooden walls of the house, but inside, in the tense and fragile quiet, a different kind of storm was just beginning to brew. The storm blew itself out by dawn. One moment the world was a howling, churning chaos of sand and wind. The next, there was a profound and ringing silence, a clean, washed light, the color of pale honey, spilled over the horizon, illuminating a landscape that had been scoured clean. Maggie stood by the small window in Jonah Kane's cabin, watching the new day arrive. The air was cool and carried the scent of wet creosote and damp earth, a fragrance of renewal. Behind her, Jonah was already moving. He stoked the fire in the stove, the scrape of the iron poker the only sound in the room. He worked with an economy of motion. A man who wasted nothing, not a word, not a gesture. Ellie was still asleep on the cot, a small lump under a heavy quilt, her breathing soft and even. Last night, after a tense, mostly silent meal of beans and stale bread, Jonah had taken the floor with a single blanket, leaving his own bed for Maggie. She had tried to protest, but the look he gave her was enough to silence any argument. It was not kindness. It was a rigid code of conduct, as unyielding as the man himself. Now, with the storm past, the terms of her stay had expired. She was expected to leave. The thought was a leaden weight in her chest. To go back out there, to face the whispers and the closed doors, to be once again the unwanted woman. She turned from the window. The storm has passed. It was a simple statement of fact, but it hung in the air between them, laden with unspoken questions. Jonah straightened up from the stove and finally looked at her. In the soft morning light, the harsh lines of his face seemed to have softened. She could see the weariness in his eyes more clearly, the faint smudges of sleeplessness beneath them. It has, he agreed. He gestured toward the coffee pot. There's coffee. It was a small thing, but it was a crack in the wall of his reserve. It was not a dismissal. Not yet. Maggie poured herself a cup of the strong, black liquid, her hands wrapping around the tin mug for its warmth. She watched him as he moved to the door, pulling on his heavy work boots. I've got lumber to sort, he said, his hand on the latch. The tarp likely came loose. He paused, his back still to her. The child. She'll be wanting breakfast when she wakes. He said it as if he were commenting on the weather, a statement of irrefutable fact that had nothing to do with her. And then he was gone, the door clicking shut behind him, leaving Maggie alone in the quiet house with his sleeping daughter. She stood frozen for a long moment, the coffee mug warm in her hands. It was not a request, but it was not a command for her to leave, either. It was an opening, a space left for her to fill. For the first time since stepping off that train, Maggie felt a flicker of purpose. It was a simple, domestic thing, but it was an anchor in the swirling sea of her uncertainty. When Ellie awoke, it was to the smell of frying bacon and fresh coffee. Maggie had found the larder, a small but well-stocked pantry, and had set about making a proper breakfast. She moved about the unfamiliar kitchen with a quiet competence born of years of making do. Ellie sat up on the cot, rubbing her eyes, her gaze fixing on Maggie with a look of pure, unadulterated joy. You're still here, the child breathed, as if Maggie were a phantom she had feared would vanish with the daylight. I'm still here, Maggie confirmed, a small, tentative smile touching her lips. Are you hungry? That morning set a new pattern. After breakfast, Maggie tidied the cabin, sweeping the fine layer of dust that had infiltrated every crack and crevice during the storm. She washed the few dishes, heated water for washing. She found a pile of mending in a basket by the hearth, a pair of Jonah's work shirts, the elbows worn thin, and one of Ellie's small dresses, the hem torn, with a needle and thread from her own valise. She sat in the rocking horse's chair and began to sew. The simple, repetitive motion was calming. The cabin grew warm and smelled of soap and wood smoke. It began to feel less like a man's austere shelter and more like a home. Jonah returned at midday, his silence as solid as ever. He stopped in the doorway, his eyes taking in the scene. He saw the swept floor, the neatly mended shirts folded on the table, and his daughter sitting on the floor at Maggie's feet, listening with rapt attention as Maggie pointed to the words in an old, worn primer she had found on a shelf. His expression was unreadable. He washed his hands at the basin, the splashing water loud in the quiet room, and sat at the table. He ate the stew Maggie had prepared without a word of praise or complaint. But when he was finished, he looked at the mended shirt. He ran a calloused thumb over the neat, even stitches on the elbow. He said nothing, but he didn't put the shirt away. He left it sitting on the table, a silent acknowledgement. Days bled into one another, marked by the rising and setting of a relentless sun. Maggie did not leave. Jonah did not ask her to. An unspoken arrangement fell into place. She became the quiet, efficient caretaker of his home, and he became its stoic, distant provider. She cooked, she cleaned, she mended. She brought an order to the house that went beyond his own Spartan neatness. She aired out the blankets, scrubbed the floorboards until they shone, and even managed to coax a stubborn desert bloom to life in a tin can on the windowsill. Her greatest joy, however, was Ellie. The child was a thirsty sponge for knowledge and affection. Maggie taught her the alphabet, guiding her small hand as she formed the letters on a slate. She taught her sums and told her stories of her life back east, of the great cities and the green hills that must have seemed like a fairy tale to a child of the desert. She discovered a quick, bright mind and a deep well of loneliness that matched her own. In Ellie's unquestioning acceptance, Maggie found a balm for the raw wound of her public humiliation. When Ellie called her mama, she no longer corrected her. The word was a secret treasure, a term of endearment spoken only within the four walls of the cabin. Jonah remained a fortress. He worked from sunup to sundown at his carpentry, the rhythmic sound of his hammer, and saw a constant backdrop to their days. He spoke only when necessary, his words as spare and functional as his tools. Yet, Maggie began to learn the man through his silences. She saw the way he watched Ellie, a fierce, protective love in his gaze that was a stark contrast to his hard exterior. She noticed how he always left the best cut of meat for his daughter, how he had carved her little rocking horse with such intricate, loving detail. And she began to feel his eyes on her. Sometimes, when she was reading to Ellie or humming a quiet tune as she worked, she would look up and find him watching, his hands stilled from their work, his expression thoughtful, guarded. The moment their eyes met, he would look away, his defenses snapping back into place. But the moments lingered. They were building a language without words, a shared existence in the quiet spaces between the sounds of their daily lives. The town of Dry Creek, however, was not silent. When Maggie had to venture out for supplies, she felt the stares, heard the whispers that died as she drew near. There she is, the carpenter's woman. Shameless. Ain't it just moved right in? Keeping another man's bride? Thomas Reed's bride. The words were like stones thrown from the shadows. She held her head high, her face a mask of dignified composure. But the shame burned. She was living in a man's house without the benefit of marriage, a fallen woman in the eyes of the righteous. Her position was untenable, a constant source of internal conflict. Every night, she lay on the small cot and told herself she would leave in the morning. She still had some money. She could get a ticket to another town, start again where no one knew her story. But then morning would come, and Ellie would run to her with a bright smile. And the thought of leaving felt like a betrayal, like abandoning the only light she had found in this desolate land. She was torn between her pride and this fragile, unexpected sense of belonging. One afternoon, Jonah came home earlier than usual. He carried a heavy plank of fragrant cedar wood, and he worked at his bench just outside the open door as Maggie prepared their supper. He was uncharacteristically quiet, his movements tighter, more controlled than usual. Maggie sensed a storm brewing within him, one far more turbulent than the sandstorm that had thrown them together. Ellie ran out to him, holding up a small, crumpled piece of paper. "Look, Papa, look what I can do," she exclaimed, her voice filled with pride. On the paper, in wobbly, oversized letters, she had written her own name, Llie. Jonah stopped his planing and took the paper. He stared at the letters for a long time. Maggie watched from the doorway, her heart in her throat. She saw his knuckles turn white where he gripped the wood plane. "She taught you that?" he asked, his voice low and tight. He didn't look at Ellie. He looked at the name, as if it were an accusation. "Mama taught me," Ellie said happily. "She's teaching me to read all the books." Jonah slowly folded the piece of paper and tucked it into his pocket. He looked up, and his eyes met Maggie's across the threshold. The look in them was complex, a painful mixture of gratitude and a deep, profound sorrow. It was the look of a man whose carefully constructed walls were beginning to crumble. He had buried his wife, Sarah, 5 years ago, after she had bled her life out, bringing Ellie into the world. In his grief, he had sealed off his heart, believing it was the only way to protect himself and his daughter from any more pain. He had created a world for them that was safe, ordered, and empty of a woman's touch. Now, this stranger, this woman nobody wanted, had walked into that world and filled it with warmth, with learning, with the smell of baking bread. She had awakened a part of his daughter he had not known how to reach. And in doing so, she was awakening feelings in him that he had sworn to keep buried forever. He was afraid. He was afraid of the hope she brought, because hope was a fragile thing in this land, easily broken. The tension finally snapped a few days later. It was a clear, hot afternoon. Ellie had been out playing in the scrub behind the cabin. She came running inside, her face flushed with excitement, her small hands cupped carefully together. "Mama," she said, her voice a reverent whisper, "look, it's for you." She opened her hands. Inside lay a small, delicate bouquet of desert marigolds, their bright yellow petals a startling splash of color against her dusty palms. They were wildflowers, tenacious and beautiful, thriving in a place where nothing else seemed to grow. Maggie stared at the flowers, at the child's beaming, expectant face. It was such a small gesture. A handful of weeds, really, but it was an offering of love, pure and simple. It was a claim. In this child's eyes, she was not the jilted bride, the charity case, the fallen woman. She was Mama. She was chosen. A wave of emotion so powerful it stole her breath, washed over her. It was a tidal wave of all the grief, all the humiliation, all the loneliness she had endured. But it was also a surge of a fierce, protective love for this little girl who had seen past all of it. She felt the sting of tears and turned away abruptly, moving toward the window so they would not see her face. She braced her hands on the sill, her shoulders shaking with a silent sob. She had come to this place expecting to be a wife, to find a respectable position. Instead, she had found something far more profound and far more dangerous to a heart that had learned to protect itself. "Did I do something wrong, you?" Ellie's small voice trembled from behind her. Maggie took a deep, shuddering breath and composed herself before turning back. She knelt and took the child's hands, flowers and all, in her own. "No, sweetheart," she said, her voice thick but steady. She looked into Ellie's worried blue eyes. "You did everything right. They are the most beautiful flowers I have ever seen." She was no longer just a woman who had been left at the station. She was a woman who had been given flowers. And in the harsh, unforgiving light of the New Mexico desert, that felt like a miracle. The tears that Maggie shed over that simple handful of wildflowers were a private storm, a silent breaking of a drought that had lasted for years. She did not let Ellie see the full force of it, turning her back just enough to shield her face as she put the marigolds in a tin cup of water, her movements precise and steady even as her vision blurred. But Jonah, standing at the threshold of his workshop, saw it all. He saw the tremor in her shoulders, the way she bit her lip to still its trembling. He saw her composure as an act of will, a dam holding back a flood of feeling. He had spent years building his own dam, stone by solitary stone. After Sarah's death, grief had been a river threatening to drown him and the infant daughter she had left behind. He had fought it back by working until his muscles screamed for rest, by enforcing a rigid, silent order on his life, by walling off his heart so thoroughly he sometimes forgot it was still there. He had built a life that was safe because it was empty. Now, this woman was filling the empty spaces, and as he watched her fight back tears over a child's gift, he felt the first, terrifying cracks appear in his own foundation. The feeling that rushed in was not grief, not exactly. It was a sharp, painful ache of recognition. It was the return of feeling itself, and it felt like a trespass. He retreated into the scent of sawdust and cedar, the rasp of his plane on wood the only language he trusted. But the image of her shaking shoulders stayed with him, superimposed over the grain of the wood. In the weeks that followed, the unspoken arrangement in the cabin deepened into a quiet rhythm, as ingrained as the rising of the sun. It was a life measured not in words, but in shared tasks and small, significant gestures. Maggie learned the specific way Jonah liked his coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, and black. She learned that he planed his most difficult pieces in the cool of the early morning, when the wood was less likely to split. In return, he learned her habits. He started leaving a small stack of kindling by the stove each morning, knowing she rose before him to start the fire. When he saw her squinting over her mending in the dim lamplight, he appeared the next evening with a new, brighter lantern, setting it on the table without a word. It was not a gift. It was a practical solution. But as the clear, steady light fell across her work, Maggie felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the flame. Their conversations remained sparse, but their silences became more comfortable, filled with the hum of domestic life. Maggie would read to Ellie from the primer, her voice a soft murmur, while Jonah sat at the other end of the table, sharpening his chisels. He would pretend not to listen, his focus entirely on the whetstone and oil. But sometimes a small smile would touch his lips when Ellie successfully sounded out a difficult word. They were a strange, silent trio, orbiting each other in the small cabin, their paths starting to form a predictable, comforting pattern. Maggie's world was shrinking to the size of that cabin, to the circle of lamplight in the evenings, to the small hand that slipped into hers on their walks, and within that small world, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known was possible. But the world outside the cabin walls had not forgotten her. The gossip in Dry Creek had taken root and grown into a thorny vine. Maggie was no longer just the mail-order bride who had been left at the station. She was now the carpenter's woman, a title spoken with a sneer or a pitying shake of the head, depending on who was talking. When she went to the general store for flour and beans, conversations would halt. The women would draw together in tight, whispering knots, their eyes following her with a mixture of censure and morbid curiosity. One afternoon, Mrs. Gable, the portly wife of the town sheriff, stopped her just outside the store. Her hands were planted on her ample hips, her face a mask of false concern. "Miss Callahan," she began, her voice dripping with condescension. "A word, if I may." Maggie steeled herself, her grip tightening on her shopping basket. "Mrs. Gable." "I do hope you are comfortable," the woman said, drawing the word out. She glanced pointedly toward Jonah's house at the edge of town. It cannot be an easy situation for a respectable woman. The insult was clear, wrapped in the guise of sympathy. "I am quite all right, thank you," Maggie said, her voice cooler than she felt. "Of course, dear Mrs." Gable patted her arm with a fleshy hand. "It's just that people do talk. A man like Jonah Kane, a widower, and a woman of your age, living under the same roof, it gives rise to speculation. It's for the child's sake I mention it. You understand, a young girl needs a proper example." Each word was a carefully aimed dart. A woman of your age? An improper example. The shame Maggie had been holding at bay washed over her, hot and suffocating. She was a nurse who had tended to dying soldiers with honor. She was a woman who had survived loss and poverty with her dignity intact. And here, in this dusty, God-forsaken town, her character was being shredded by the idle tongues of hypocrites. "My arrangement with Mr. Kane is a matter of necessity and nothing more," Maggie said, her voice trembling slightly despite her efforts to control it. "And I assure you, his daughter is well cared for." She turned and walked away before Mrs. Gable could reply, her back ramrod straight, her head held high. She did not run, but every step was a flight. She didn't slow until the door of the cabin was closed firmly behind her. She leaned against it, her eyes closed, the woman's words echoing in her mind. She was living a lie. This fragile peace she had found was built on a foundation of impropriety. In trying to find a place for herself, she was risking the reputation of the very people who had shown her shelter. She looked around the small room at the neatly stacked firewood, at Ellie's slate with its chalky letters, at the rocking horse Jonah had carved. It was a home. It felt more like a home than any place she had ever known. But it wasn't hers. She was a ghost in someone else's life, a temporary fixture who was causing irreparable damage. The conflict tore at her. To stay meant enduring the town's judgment, a constant, grinding assault on her self-respect. It meant accepting a place in the shadows, a woman with no name of her own, defined only by the man she lived with. But to leave meant tearing herself away from Ellie. It meant returning to the profound and crushing loneliness that had been her only companion for so long. It felt like an impossible choice, a tearing in two of her very soul. That night, Jonah was later than usual. A rancher's wagon had broken an axle a few miles out of town, and he had been called to fix it. Maggie put Ellie to bed and sat by the dying fire, the mending basket untouched in her lap. The confrontation with Mrs. Gable had unsettled her, dredging up all her insecurities. Was she being selfish? Was she clinging to this place for her own sake? Heedless of the consequences for Jonah and Ellie, when Jonah finally returned, he was bone-weary. He moved with a heavy slowness, the day's labor etched into every line of his body. He nodded to Maggie and moved to the basin to wash. As he sluiced the dust and grime from his face and hands, Maggie noticed a small, white scar on his forearm, half hidden by his rolled-up sleeve. "You're hurt," she said, her voice quiet in the sleeping house. He glanced down at his arm as if just remembering the injury. "It's nothing. A slip of the chisel this morning." "Let me see," she said, the nurse in her taking over. She rose and brought the lantern closer. The cut wasn't deep, but it was ragged and had been bleeding. It needed to be cleaned and bound properly. She went to her valise and took out a small cloth bundle containing carbolic soap, clean bandages, and a tin of salve remnants of her old life. "Sit," she instructed, her tone gentle but firm. For a moment, he looked like he might refuse. He was not a man who accepted help easily, but he was too tired to argue, and there was a quiet authority in her voice that he found himself unable to resist. He sat at the table, and she pulled up a chair beside him, placing the lantern between them. She cleaned the wound with a practiced efficiency, her touch light and sure. The scent of carbolic soap filled the small space. Jonah sat perfectly still, his arm extended, watching her. He watched her nimble fingers as they worked, her brow furrowed in concentration. The light cast a soft glow on her face, smoothing away the lines of worry and fatigue, revealing a strength and a quiet beauty he had not allowed himself to see before. His mind drifted back 5 years, to another night, another woman's touch. Sarah had been soft and laughing, her hands fluttering like birds. She had been his light, his joy. And then she was gone, her life traded for their daughters in a torrent of blood and pain that still haunted his nightmares. He had sworn he would never risk that pain again. He would never let another woman get close enough to leave another such gaping wound in his life. But this woman, she was not like Sarah. Maggie was not soft. She was resilient, like the desert wildflowers Ellie had picked. She had a core of tempered steel forged in hardship. Her hands were not fluttering. They were steady, capable, healing. As she wrapped a clean bandage around his arm, her fingers brushed against his skin. The touch was brief, professional, but it sent a jolt through him, a current of warmth that spread up his arm and settled deep in his chest. It was a feeling he had thought long dead, and its return was terrifying. He pulled his arm back abruptly the moment she was finished. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough. He stood up and moved away from the table, away from the lamplight, away from her. He stood by the cold hearth, his back to her, a rigid silhouette in the shadows. Maggie's hands fell to her lap. His sudden withdrawal was like a physical blow. She had seen the look in his eyes in the lamplight, a flicker of something vulnerable, something soft. And then it was gone, shuttered away behind his usual mask of impenetrable solitude. She had overstepped. The simple, humane act of tending a wound had been mistaken for something more, a familiarity he could not tolerate. "This," she thought with a painful clarity, "is why I must go. This house is too small for his ghosts and for me." The silence stretched, thick with unspoken fears and regrets. "Finally," Jonah spoke, his voice low and strained, directed at the cold stones of the fireplace. "She looks for you. In the morning," he said. "Ellie, the first thing she does when she opens her eyes is look to your cot to make sure you're still here." He turned then, and his face was a raw landscape of a pain he could no longer hide. "I don't know what you are, Maggie Callahan. I don't know if you're a blessing or a curse, but my daughter, she believes you're her mother. Come back from a dream. and I don't have the heart to wake her up." He held her gaze for a long, aching moment, and in his eyes, she did not see a command or a plea. She saw a truce, a confession of his own weakness, his own fear, his own desperate need. He was a man drowning, and he was admitting, for the first time, that she was the one keeping his daughter's head, and perhaps his own, above water. In that moment, Maggie's conflict resolved itself, not with a logical decision, but with a quiet surrender. The whispers of the town, her own wounded pride, his fears and her own, they all faded in the face of the simple, stark truth he had laid bare. A little girl looked for her in the morning, and for now, that would have to be enough. Jonah's confession by the cold hearth was not an end, but a beginning. It did not magically erase the town's scorn or Maggie's deep-seated sense of displacement, but it shifted the ground beneath their feet. He had named the fragile thing that was growing between the three of them, and in naming it, had given it a kind of legitimacy, at least within the four walls of the cabin. The silence that followed was different, no longer a void of unspoken anxieties, but a shared space of acknowledged vulnerability. Life settled into a new, deeper rhythm. Jonah still spoke little, but his quietness was no longer a wall. It was a presence. He would watch Maggie teach Ellie her letters, and the corner of his mouth would lift in a way that was almost a smile. He began to leave his finest pieces of carving, a small, smooth-sanded bird, a detailed horse on the windowsill, unspoken gifts for his daughter that were also, somehow, offerings to the woman who had brought learning and laughter back into his house. For Maggie, the fear of being cast out began to recede, replaced by a tentative, blossoming hope. She allowed herself to fully inhabit her role, to care for Jonah and Ellie not as a temporary duty, but as an act of love. She learned the landscape of their lives, the worn patch on the floor where Jonah stood to shave, the loose board on the porch that Ellie always jumped over, the way the evening light fell across the table. These small, intimate details were the threads she began to weave into a life. She was still a woman with no official place, but she had found her purpose. The past, however, is not a place one can simply leave behind. It has a way of riding into town when you least expect it. It happened on a Saturday, a day when the heat was a physical weight and the dust of the main street rose in lazy, golden clouds. Jonah had gone into town to deliver a set of kitchen cabinets to the sheriff's wife, a job he had taken on with his usual stoic reluctance. Maggie had asked him to pick up a few supplies, and he'd grumbled about it, but she knew he would remember everything on her list. The saloon was busier than usual. Ranch hands, having been paid for the month, were gathered to wash the trail dust from their throats with cheap whiskey. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer, sweat, and boastful talk. Jonah was not a saloon man. He preferred the quiet of his workshop to the forced joviality of other men. But Sheriff Gable was settling his accounts at a table in the corner, and so Jonah found himself standing by the bar, waiting, a solitary island of silence in a sea of noise. And then a voice cut through the din, loud and self-important. "Another round for my friends here," the man declared, slapping a coin on the bar. "A man of property must be generous. Ain't that right?" Jonah paid him no mind at first. The saloon was full of such men, their pockets briefly heavy and their mouths full of hot air. But then the man began to tell a story, and the men around him laughed, a coarse, braying sound. So I says to myself, "Thomas, you're a man of means, but a man needs a wife to warm his bed." The man crowed. He was of medium height, with a soft belly straining the buttons of his fancy vest and a face that was beginning to show the bloat of self-indulgence. "But the pickings out here are slim, ain't they? So I put an ad in an Eastern paper, wrote a few letters, told 'em I owned a fine spread. A big house." He winked at the men around him. "A bit of an exaggeration. Maybe a man's got to sell himself, right?" A cold stillness settled over Jonah. He did not turn, but his focus sharpened, every nerve ending attuned to the voice behind him. "I got plenty of replies. The man, Thomas, went on, his voice slick with smug satisfaction. Young ones, pretty ones, but I strung along this one. A spinster. An old one. Past 30 if she was a day. A widow. Sounded desperate. You know the type. Wrote her these long, poetic letters about the sunset and building a life together. Poured it on real thick. He took a long drink of his whiskey, playing to his audience. So, what happened? One of the ranch hands asked. Did she show up? Thomas Reed threw his head back and laughed. A high, unpleasant sound. She sure did. Came chugging in on that train a month or two back. You should have seen her. All done up in her Sunday best, looking around for her handsome groom. He wiped a tear of mirth from his eye. Of course, I wasn't there. I was watching from the feed store across the street. Lord, it was the funniest thing I ever saw. Her face when she realized no one was coming. Priceless. The men around him roared with laughter. It was a fine joke. A grand story of a city woman getting her comeuppance. The humiliation of a stranger was a cheap and satisfying form of entertainment. Jonah Kane turned slowly from the bar. The noise in the room seemed to fade away until the only thing he could hear was the blood pounding in his ears. He moved toward the group, his steps measured and deliberate. The men saw him coming, and their laughter faltered. There was something in his eyes, a cold, flat fury that sucked the air out of the room. Thomas Reed, his back to Jonah, was still preening. Just a bit of fun, you know. A man gets bored, no harm done. She probably just got back on the train and went home. She didn't. The voice was low, but it had the density of granite. It cut through the remaining murmurs and hung in the suddenly silent saloon. Thomas Reed turned, a belligerent smile still on his face. The smile vanished when he saw Jonah. He didn't know who Jonah was, but he recognized the quiet, implacable danger in his stance. "What's that to you?" friend Reed asked, trying to sound casual, but his voice was a notch too high. Jonah stopped a few feet from him. He was taller than Reed, broader. He seemed to draw all the shadows in the room to himself, a figure of pure, coiled strength. He did not raise his voice. He did not have to. "The woman you're speaking of," Jonah said, his words spaced like hammer blows on an anvil, is named Margaret Callahan. Reed's face paled slightly. The men who had been his audience began to shuffle their feet and edge away, sensing that the joke had soured. Sheriff Gable watched from his table, his hand resting near his sidearm, his expression wary. I don't know who you're talking about," Reed stammered, his bravado crumbling. "You wrote her letters," Jonah continued, his voice relentless. "You made her promises. You brought her 1,000 miles from her home with lies, and then you hid in the shadows and laughed at her pain." He took another slow step forward. "You call that fun?" It wasn't a question. It was a judgment. The contempt in Jonah's voice was a palpable thing. Reed looked around for support, but the eyes of the other men were now on him, cold and appraising. They had been laughing with him moments before, but now they saw him through Jonah's eyes, a weak, cruel man who preyed on the hopeful. "Now, see here," Reed blustered, trying to regain some ground. "It was a private matter. She ain't your wife. She ain't nothing to you." He gestured dismissively. "You got no claim on her." Jonah's gaze did not flicker. He looked directly at Thomas Reed, but his words were for every man in that saloon. They were for the whole town. "She ain't your bride," Jonah said, his voice dropping even lower, yet carrying to every corner of the room. "She's family." The word settled into the profound silence. Family. It was a simple word, but in that place, at that moment, it was a barricade. It was a declaration of allegiance, a drawing of a line in the dust. He had not claimed her as a wife, or a lover, or even a friend. He had claimed her as something far more fundamental. He had claimed her as his own. Thomas Reed seemed to shrink. The fancy vest and the self-satisfied smirk could not protect him from the weight of those two words. He was an outsider who had harmed one of their own. Jonah just stood there, watching him, his silence more menacing than any threat. He did not need to raise a hand. The collective judgment of the room was doing his work for him. The bartender, a burly man named Gus, came around the bar, wiping his hands on a dirty apron. "I think you've finished your drink, Mr. Reed," Gus said, his voice flat. "Time for you to be on your way." Reed looked from Gus's hard face to Jonah's unforgiving one. There was no escape. Humiliation burned in his cheeks. He fumbled for his hat, knocking a glass off the table. He turned and practically scurried out of the saloon, the swinging doors flapping shut behind him like a final, pathetic applause. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Sheriff Gable let out a slow breath. He rose from his table and walked over to Jonah, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "Well handled, Kane," he said gruffly. "Man like that gives the rest of us a bad name." The other men in the room nodded in agreement, their expressions a mixture of respect and a shamefaced recognition of their own complicity. They had laughed at the joke. Now they saw the woman behind it. Jonah simply gave a curt nod, his face unreadable. He collected his payment from the sheriff, picked up the sack of supplies he had come for, and walked out into the blinding sunlight, leaving the whispers and the newfound respect behind him. He did not tell Maggie what had happened. When he returned to the cabin, the sun was low in the sky, painting the desert in hues of orange and purple. Ellie ran to greet him, and Maggie looked up from the stew she was stirring, a question in her eyes about his delay. He just handed her the supplies and said the sheriff was held up. But later that evening, as they sat at the table in the quiet lamplight, she felt a change. It was nothing he said or did. It was in his eyes. When he looked at her, the last of the caution, the last of the distance, was gone. The cool gray of his gaze was now warmed by a new light, a steady, protective flame. It was a look that saw past the spinster, past the stranger, and saw her, Maggie Callahan. As a woman who belonged, he had defended her honor in public, but he held that knowledge in the quiet of his own heart. The battle was over, and in the silent communion of their shared gaze, Maggie understood, without knowing why, that something had irrevocably shifted. She was no longer the woman nobody chose. She was family. The confrontation in the saloon sent a subtle ripple through the town of Dry Creek, one that Maggie felt without understanding its source. The whispers that had once followed her like biting flies seemed to quiet. The hard stare softened into looks of grudging curiosity, and, on one occasion, Mrs. Gable gave her a stiff, almost respectful nod from across the street. Maggie attributed the change to the simple passage of time, the town's gradual acceptance of the new, strange shape of the carpenter's household. She didn't know that Jonah had drawn a line in the sand around her, declaring her territory he would defend. She only knew that the air felt a little easier to breathe. Inside the cabin, the peace was more tangible. It was a solid, well-built thing, like a piece of Jonah's own furniture. He and Maggie had found a way to live around his grief and her shame, creating a space where a family, however unconventional, could begin to grow. He started talking more, not in long conversations, but in small observations shared over supper. He'd comment on the quality of a shipment of lumber or tell a short, dryly humorous story about a stubborn mule. Each word was a carefully placed stone, building a bridge across the silence that had once separated them. This fragile tranquility, however, was a house built on the edge of a precarious cliff. The West was a land that gave nothing easily, and it could take everything away in an instant. The first sign of trouble came with the heat. The sun was not a nurturing warmth, but a malevolent, white-hot eye in a bleached sky. The dust didn't stir. It hung in the air, thick and suffocating. It was a breeder of sickness, a time when the strong grew listless and the weak were pushed toward the edge. It started with the blacksmith's youngest son, a boy of 4 who complained of a headache and then, within a day, was consumed by a raging fever. Then it was 2 of the Gable children, their usual boisterous energy snuffed out, their bodies limp with a frightening lethargy. A cough took root in the town. A dry, racking sound that echoed from one house to the next. Fear, a far more contagious ailment than the fever itself, began to spread. Dr. Adams, a man whose medical knowledge was as thin as his hair, did what he could. He prescribed quinine and cool baths, but the fever did not respond. It burned through his remedies with an implacable intensity. When the Miller baby died in the night, a quiet, terrible panic set in. The following evening, under the cover of darkness, Dr. Adams loaded his buggy with his medical bag and his personal effects and rode out of town. Heading east, he left no note. He simply vanished, abandoning his post and his patients to their fate. His flight opened the floodgates of terror. Families locked their doors, viewing their neighbors as potential carriers of death. The town that had been bound by gossip and judgment was now shattered by fear and isolation. It was in this vacuum of hope and authority that Maggie Callahan found the woman she used to be. For months, she had been a housekeeper, a teacher, a quiet figure of domesticity. But as news of the doctor's desertion spread, a different instinct, honed in the blood and suffering of battlefield hospitals, took over. She heard the frantic, helpless crying of Mrs. Miller from the house next to the general store, and she could not stay inside. She turned to Jonah, her face set with a grim resolve he had never seen before. "I have to go," she said, her voice devoid of any uncertainty. "I can't promise I can help, but I know how to nurse a fever. I know how to make the sick comfortable." He looked at her, at the steel in her spine, and he saw the woman who had crossed a continent alone, who had faced down humiliation and hardship without breaking. He gave a single solemn nod. "What do you need?" "Boil water," she said, her voice already taking on the clipped, efficient tone of a head nurse. "As much as you can. Keep it boiling. And Ellie is not to leave this house. She is not to go near anyone." She went to her old valise, the one she had arrived with, and from its depths, she retrieved a canvas roll. Unfurling it on the table revealed not sewing supplies, but the tools of her former trade packets of dried herbs, yarrow for fevers, willow bark for pain rolls of clean bandages, a bottle of carbolic acid for cleaning, a small, sharp lancet. It was a soldier's medical kit, a relic of a past she had tried to leave behind. Her first stop was the Miller house. The small home was dark and stifling, thick with the smell of sickness and despair. A distraught Mr. Miller met her at the door, his face a mask of grief. Inside, his wife sat rocking, her eyes vacant, while her two other children lay listlessly on their beds, their faces flushed and their breathing shallow. Maggie took control. Her voice was calm, a steady, reassuring presence in the chaotic tide of fear. "Open the windows," she commanded. "Let the air in. Mr. Miller, go to the well. I need fresh, cool water, as much as you can carry." She moved to the children, her touch gentle but firm. She assessed their fevers with the back of her hand, listened to their breathing, checked for the rash that was the fever's signature. She worked with a focused intensity, the world shrinking to the small, hot space of that sick room. That day, Maggie Callahan became the heart of Dry Creek's fight for survival. She moved from house to house, a tireless, determined figure. She found the Gable children in a similar state and set their frantic mother to the task of bathing them in cool water. She showed the blacksmith how to brew a tea from the yarrow and willow bark. She organized the healthy women, the few who were not paralyzed by fear, into a small brigade. They followed her instructions, boiling linens, preparing thin broths, and sitting with the sick so that exhausted parents could get an hour of sleep. Jonah was her silent, unwavering shadow. He did not go into the sick rooms, honoring her command to stay away from the contagion, but he became her quartermaster. He hauled endless buckets of water. He chopped firewood for a dozen different stoves. He used his strong, steady hands to grind herbs with a mortar and pestle. He stood guard over his own home, ensuring Ellie remained safe inside. But his thoughts, his fears, were with Maggie. Every time she left the cabin, He watched her go with a knot of dread in his stomach. He saw the toll the work was taking on her. The dark circles under her eyes grew deeper. Her movements, once so brisk, became slower, weighted with a fatigue that went bone deep. She was giving all of herself to the town, pouring out her strength, and he was terrified that she had nothing left to save for herself. His fears were realized a week into the crisis. She came home late one evening, stumbling with exhaustion. She leaned against the doorframe, her face pale and beaded with sweat. Though the night air was cool, Maggie Jonah's voice was sharp with alarm. "I'm just tired," she whispered. But as she stepped into the light, he saw the telltale flush in her cheeks and the unnatural brightness of her eyes. She was burning with the same fever she had been fighting. He helped her to his own bed, ignoring her weak protests. He pulled the quilt over her as she began to shiver, her body racked with chills. For the first time, Jonah felt the cold steel grip of true helplessness. He could build a house from nothing, mend any broken thing, but he could not fight this invisible enemy that was consuming the woman he had come to. He could not even form the word in his mind. But the fever had one more cruel blow to deliver. The next morning, Ellie did not wake with her usual chatter. She lay still and quiet on her cot. When Jonah touched her forehead, the heat he felt seared his hand like a brand. His world, which had been slowly and painstakingly rebuilt, shattered into a million pieces. He had lost his wife. He could not lose his daughter. He could not. The thought was a raw, physical agony. He paced the small cabin like a caged lion, his terror a palpable force. Maggie, weak and delirious in his bed, heard his heavy footsteps, heard the ragged sound of his breathing. The mother in her, a force now more powerful than any fever, fought its way through the fog of her own illness. With a strength she did not possess, she pushed herself out of the bed, her legs unsteady, her vision swimming. "Jonah!" she rasped, her voice a dry crackle. She stumbled toward the cot where Ellie lay. "Get back in bed," he ordered, his voice thick with desperation. "You'll kill yourself." She ignored him. She collapsed onto the floor beside the cot, her hand finding Ellie's. The child's skin was dry and frighteningly hot. Ellie moaned, her eyes fluttering but not opening. This was Maggie's Gethsemane, in the dim, quiet cabin. Surrounded by the man's desperate fear, she faced the ultimate test. Her body was a traitor, clamoring for rest, for surrender. But her heart, the heart that had been claimed by a little girl on a train platform, would not yield. Jonah watched, paralyzed, as she began her work. She dipped a cloth in the basin of cool water he had set out and began to bathe Ellie's face, her neck, her small, limp arms. Her own hands trembled with weakness, but her touch was infinitely tender. Her movements were slow, agonizingly so, but they were filled with a purpose so fierce it was terrifying to behold. The hours bled together. Jonah kept the water cool, replaced the cloths, watched as Maggie slowly, painstakingly, tended to his daughter. She did not speak to him. She spoke only to Ellie, her voice a low, constant murmur, a thread of love in the suffocating silence of the sick room. As night fell, Ellie's breathing became more shallow, her small body frighteningly still. Jonah sank into a chair, his head in his hands, a broken man. He had fought the land, fought his grief, fought the world to protect this child, and he had failed. Despair, cold and absolute, washed over him. But Maggie did not fail. She leaned closer to the child, her own face just inches from Ellie's, her own breath mingling with the girl's fevered exhalations. She was a shield, a prayer, a promise. She laid her head beside Ellie's on the small pillow, her strength utterly spent. But she did not give up. Through cracked, dry lips, she whispered into the child's ear, the words a sacred vow made in the heart of the fire. "Hold on, sweetheart," she breathed, her voice barely audible, yet containing the force of a lifetime of love. "Hold on, I'm right here." She stayed like that, a guardian angel burning with her own fever, a mother born not of blood but of a tenacious, unconquerable belief. She was a woman who had been left with nothing, who had been scorned and rejected, and she was laying down her life, breath by precious breath, for a child who had simply pointed and said, "That's my mama." And in the darkest hour of that long night, Jonah Kane looked upon her, and he understood that he was witnessing the truest form of love he would ever know. The night wore on, an endless, suffocating blanket woven from silence, fear, and the shallow rasp of a child's breathing. Jonah sat in the chair he had pulled close to the cot, a statue carved from despair. He had done everything Maggie would have done, kept the cloths cool, tried to spoon a little water between Ellie's cracked lips, kept the fire low. But he was not a healer. He was a builder, a man who worked with solid, predictable things. This sickness was a phantom, an enemy he could not see or strike, and it was stealing his daughter before his eyes. Beside the cot, half lying on the floor, was Maggie. She had not moved for hours, her body a testament to utter exhaustion, her hand still loosely clasping Ellie's. Her own fever raged, and Jonah could hear the faint, dry whisper of her breathing. She was fighting a war on two fronts, one for the child and one for herself, and he could see she was losing. The thought was an icy fist closing around his heart. To lose them both, it was a possibility so monstrous his mind refused to fully grasp it. He was suspended in a waking nightmare, waiting for the final, terrible silence. It was in that darkest hour, when the lamp was burning low and the first pale hint of gray touched the window, that the change came. It was so subtle at first he thought he had imagined it. A slight easing in the tension of Ellie's small body, a single, clear drop of sweat that formed on her temple. Then another. It was not the dry, scorching heat of the fever, but a different kind of moisture. A release. Jonah leaned forward. His own breathing stopped, his entire being focused on the child. Her breathing, which had been a shallow, frantic flutter, seemed to deepen. It was still ragged, but there was a substance to it now, a rhythm. He laid his calloused, trembling hand on her forehead. The skin was still hot, but the terrifying, unnatural fire was gone. It was the warmth of a sleeping child, not the inferno of a dying one. A sound, a ragged cross between a sob and a gasp, escaped his lips. The tension that had held him rigid for a day and a night broke, and a wave of relief so profound it was physically painful washed over him. He felt the muscles in his back and shoulders unlock, and he could breathe again, a deep, shuddering intake of air, as if drawn by the sound of his hope. Ellie's eyelids flickered. She stirred, her head moving slightly on the pillow, her lips parted, and a single, cracked word emerged, no louder than a sigh. "Mama." It was the sound of a ship finding its harbor after a storm. It was the sound of his world returning to its axis. At the sound of Ellie's voice, Maggie's head lifted from the pillow. Her eyes, clouded with her own fever, struggled to focus. She saw Ellie stir, saw the sheen of sweat on her brow. A faint, luminous smile touched her lips, a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. She had seen her patient through the crisis. Her work was done, and having done it, her body surrendered its long and brutal fight. Her eyes rolled back, and she slumped sideways, a boneless, silent collapse onto the hard wooden floor. Maggie Jonah was on his feet in an instant, his own relief forgotten in a fresh surge of panic. He knelt beside her, gathering her into his arms. She was terrifyingly light, a fragile collection of bones and will. Her skin was aflame, far hotter than Ellie's now was. He had been so focused on his daughter that he hadn't seen how close to the edge Maggie had come. She had poured her own life force into Ellie, leaving nothing for herself. He lifted her easily, cradling her against his chest. He carried her across the room and laid her gently in the center of his own bed. He pulled the quilt over her shivering frame, his movements clumsy with a desperate tenderness. He looked from the sleeping, recovering child to the unconscious, burning woman. He had been given back his daughter, but he knew with a terrible certainty that the price might be Maggie's life. He sat on the edge of the bed, a sentinel now for her. He bathed her face with a fresh cloth, his large, rough hands surprisingly gentle. He tried to give her water, but she could not swallow. He could only watch and wait and fight the crushing sense of his own inadequacy. He was in her debt, a debt so immense he could never repay it. She had faced down death for his child. All he could do was sit by her side and pray to a God he had long since stopped speaking to. He reached out and took her hand. It lay limp and hot in his own. Her fingers were slender, her knuckles calloused from work. It was a hand that had healed soldiers, mended clothes, taught a child to write her name, and held his daughter back from the abyss. He laced his fingers through hers, holding on as if he could anchor her to the world of the living through his own strength. It was the first time he had ever touched her by choice, the first time he had reached for her not out of necessity, but out of a deep, aching need. He leaned close, his head bowed, his mustache brushing the back of her hand. His voice, when he spoke, was a raw, broken whisper, meant only for her. "You stayed," he said, the words torn from the deepest part of him. "When everyone else ran, the doctor, everyone, you stayed." He squeezed her hand, a desperate, silent plea. "Stay now. Maggie, please, just stay." He did not leave her side for 2 days and 2 nights. Ellie, weak but lucid, watched him from her cot, her blue eyes wide and solemn. She understood, in the way that children do, that the battle had moved, that Mama was now the one who needed saving. Slowly, agonizingly, Maggie's fever began to recede. The crisis passed not in a sudden breaking, but in a gradual, grudging retreat. Her shivering subsided, her breathing eased, and on the morning of the 3rd day, she opened her eyes. They were clear. She looked at Jonah, sitting slumped and exhausted in the chair beside her, her hand still held firmly in his. She looked at her hand in his, then back at his face, and a flicker of a question appeared in her gaze. He released her hand as if he'd been burned, a flush rising on his weathered cheeks. "Your fever's broken," he said gruffly, his voice thick from lack of sleep. "Ellie's fine. She's been asking for you." That was all he said, but it was everything. As Maggie slowly regained her strength, she became aware of a new kind of quiet in Dry Creek. It was not the fearful, shuttered silence of the plague, but a peaceful, respectful stillness. The town was healing, and it was giving her the space to do the same. One afternoon, as she was sitting on the porch for the first time, wrapped in a quilt, a knock came at the door. It was Sheriff Gable, his hat in his hands, his face scrubbed and solemn. Beside him stood his wife, her usual haughty expression replaced by one of raw, humbled gratitude. She was holding a covered basket. "Miss Callahan," the sheriff began, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "The town, we wanted to thank you. My own too. They wouldn't be here if it weren't for you." "Mrs. Gable stepped forward, her eyes not quite meeting Maggie's. "I've brought some broth," she said, her voice tight with emotion. "And a fresh loaf. It's not much." She placed the basket on the porch floor. "What you did, after Dr. Adams left us, we won't forget it." She finally looked at Maggie, and her eyes were filled with an undisguised awe. "You saved our children." It was the beginning of a quiet, steady pilgrimage to the carpenter's small house. The blacksmith came and left a skillfully wrought iron trivet on the porch step. Mrs. Miller, her own grief still raw, brought a jar of pickled peaches she had put up the previous fall. They came not with fanfare, but with the humble, heartfelt offerings of a people who understood the value of a life given back from the brink. They no longer saw her as the abandoned mail-order bride or the carpenter's questionable house guest. They saw her as she was a woman of substance, of courage, of quiet, unshakable strength. She had earned her place not with a marriage certificate, but with her own 2 hands and a heart that refused to quit. Maggie received their gifts with a quiet, humble grace. She did not feel like a hero. She felt like a nurse who had simply done her duty. Her true reward was seeing the town come back to life. It was hearing the clang of the blacksmith's hammer again, seeing children playing in the street, watching Ellie grow stronger each day, her laughter a bright, clear sound in the afternoon sun. The fever had been a crucible, burning away the last of the town's prejudice and her own uncertainty. It had tested them all, and from the ashes, something new and strong was emerging. One evening, she sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant, violent strokes of orange and pink. The desert was still a harsh, unforgiving place, but for the first time, she did not feel like a stranger in it. Jonah came and stood in the doorway behind her, his presence a warm, solid comfort. He did not speak, but he didn't need to. They watched the last of the light fade together. The land was hard, but it was also a place where a person could be tested and found worthy. A place where hope, like the tenacious desert wildflowers, could find a way to bloom in the most unlikely of places. The passing of the fever was like the receding of a flood. It left behind a landscape of exhaustion and loss, but also one of clean-swept gratitude. The town of Dry Creek, having stared into the abyss together, was subtly reforged. The old lines of gossip and judgment had been washed away, replaced by the stronger bonds of shared survival. At the center of this new geography stood Maggie Callahan, no longer an outsider but the quiet, undisputed heart of their recovery. In the weeks that followed, the change in her standing was a palpable thing. When she walked to the general store, women would stop sweeping their porches to offer a genuine smile. Men would tip their hats with a deference that went beyond mere politeness. They were acknowledging a debt, but more than that, they were acknowledging her. They saw her not for the circumstances that had brought her to their town, but for the character she had revealed in its darkest hour. For Maggie, this acceptance was a balm on a wound she hadn't realized was still so raw, but the true healing was happening within the walls of the small cabin at the edge of town. The shared crucible of the fever had burned away the last of the restraints between her and Jonah. The space between them was no longer filled with unspoken grief or tentative uncertainty, but with a deep, quiet understanding that needed no words. He watched her with an unguarded tenderness that made her heart ache. He saw the lingering weariness in her movements and would insist she rest, taking over the cooking with a clumsy but determined effort. He began bringing her small things from his workshop, a perfectly sanded block of cedar whose fragrance filled the room, a small, intricately carved box for her sewing needles. They were not courting gifts. They were offerings, humble acknowledgments of the beauty and order she had brought back into his life. Maggie, in turn, saw the man beneath the calloused, silent exterior. She saw the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when Ellie said something particularly clever. She saw the gentle, almost reverent way he handled his tools, the deep respect he had for the wood he worked. She saw a good, strong man who had been terrified of feeling again, and she watched, with a quiet joy, as he slowly, carefully, began to let himself feel. The unspoken truth of their love grew in the rich soil of this shared life. It was in the way he would look up from his work just to watch her read by the firelight. It was in the way she would save him the last piece of pie, knowing it was his favorite. It was in the easy, comfortable silence they could now share, a silence that was not empty but full of a deep and abiding peace. One evening, after Ellie was asleep, Jonah did not go to his workshop as he usually did. He stayed at the table, turning a small, cloth-wrapped object over and over in his large hands. Maggie watched him, her mending stilled in her lap. There was a gravity to his demeanor, a nervous energy that was entirely foreign to him. Finally, he looked up, his gaze direct and serious. "My mother," he began, his voice a little rough. She came west with my father with nothing but what they could carry. They built their house with their own hands. She was a strong woman, like you." He paused, collecting his thoughts. "She didn't have much in the way of fine things, but she had a set of silver spoons her own mother had given her. They came all the way from Pennsylvania. She treasured them." He slowly unwrapped the cloth. Lying in his palm were two old, tarnished silver spoons, their handles worn smooth with use. "When Sarah and I were married," he continued, his voice dropping as he spoke his late wife's name, "my mother gave me one of the spoons. She said a family should be built on things that last." He looked at the spoon, his thoughts 1,000 miles away. Then his focus returned to Maggie. "After the fever, after I almost lost everything all over again, I understood what she meant. It ain't about silver, or houses, or anything you can buy. It's about what you hold on to when everything else is burning down." He pushed one of the spoons across the table toward her. "I'm not a man for fancy words. Maggie, you know that, but what I feel for you, it's a thing that lasts." He didn't say he loved her. He didn't have to. The words were there in his eyes, in the offering of this simple, precious piece of his past. Maggie looked at the spoon, its surface glowing softly in the lamplight, and she felt the last of her own defenses melt away. She reached out and her fingers brushed his as she touched the spoon. "Jonah," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. He spent the next several nights in his workshop, the sound of a soft, rhythmic tapping echoing in the cool desert air. He told Maggie he was working on a special commission, and she did not press him. She trusted him. The town decided to hold a festival, a celebration of their survival. It wasn't a grand affair. A few long tables were set up in the dusty space between the church and the general store. The women brought what they could: stews and fresh-baked bread, pies made from the last of the preserved summer fruit. A local rancher who played the fiddle was persuaded to provide some music. It was a simple, heartfelt gathering, a collective sigh of relief and a testament to the community's resilience. Jonah insisted they go. Maggie was hesitant at first, still not entirely comfortable being the center of the town's attention, but he was quietly insistent, and Ellie was vibrating with excitement at the prospect of a party. So Maggie put on her best dress, the same one she had worn when she first arrived, and they walked into town together, not as a carpenter and his housekeeper, but as a family. The setting sun cast long shadows, and the air was filled with the murmur of conversation and the smell of wood smoke and cooking food. As they approached, a hush fell over the gathering, but it was not the hostile silence of her arrival. It was a silence of respect, of welcome. Sheriff Gable was the first to move, stepping forward with a broad smile. "Jonah, Miss Callahan, Ellie," he boomed, his voice full of warmth. "Glad you could make it. Find a place. There's plenty for all." It was a public, formal acceptance. Maggie felt the tension in her shoulders ease. They were no longer a spectacle. They were guests. They were neighbors. They ate, and they listened to the lively, scratchy music from the fiddle. Ellie danced with the other children, her face alight with a joy that was beautiful to behold. Maggie sat beside Jonah, a quiet sense of rightness settling over her. She looked at the faces around her, the Gables, the Millers, the blacksmith and his wife, and she saw not the judgmental strangers who had scorned her, but a community of flawed, resilient people who had faced a great trial and emerged kinder for it. As the sky deepened to a bruised purple and the lanterns were lit, casting a warm, flickering glow over the scene, Jonah stood up. He took Maggie's hand, his grip firm and steady. "Come with me," he said quietly. He led her to the open space where the children had been dancing. The fiddler, sensing a moment, let his music trail off into a soft, lingering note. All eyes turned to them. Jonah Kane was not a man who sought the spotlight, and his public gesture commanded the absolute attention of everyone present. He stood before her, tall and solemn in the lantern light, He did not let go of her hand. From his pocket, he took a small, shining object. It was a ring, simple and unadorned, fashioned from the hammered, polished silver of his mother's spoon. It glowed with a soft, lunar light, a perfect, unbroken circle. He looked not at Maggie, but at the townspeople, at the faces of his neighbors lit by the lantern flames. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it carried the weight of an unshakable conviction, and it reached every ear. When Miss Callahan first came to Dry Creek, she was a stranger, he began, his words measured and clear. She was owed a welcome that she did not receive. From me and from all of us. A few people shuffled their feet, their gazes dropping in shared shame. We judged her by her age, and by the fact that she came here alone. We saw what was on the surface. We didn't see the strength, or the courage, or the goodness she carried inside her. He paused, and his gaze swept over the crowd before coming to rest, finally and fully, on Maggie. His eyes were filled with a love so profound and so absolute it took her breath away. When the fever came, he continued, his voice softening, and the rest of the world ran. She stayed. She fought for our children. She fought for my child. His voice broke for a fraction of a second. A single, raw note of remembered terror. She fought for all of us. She showed us what it means to be a neighbor. She showed us what it means to have a true heart. He turned his attention back to the crowd. Some of you have wondered about her place in my home, in my life. He held up their joined hands. My daughter calls her Mama. He let the words hang in the still night air. A statement of fact more powerful than any legal document. And in my book, that's enough blessing for any man. He turned back to Maggie, his world shrinking to the space between their two hearts. He gently slid the simple silver ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. Maggie Callahan, he said, his voice now a low murmur meant only for her. I ain't a rich man. I can't offer you fine things. All I have is a strong back, a good name, and a heart that is entirely yours. Will you have me? Will you be my wife? Tears were streaming down Maggie's face, catching the lantern light like diamonds. They were not tears of sorrow or shame, but tears of a joy so pure and overwhelming it felt like a flood, washing away all the years of loneliness and hurt. She looked from his earnest, open face to the silver ring on her finger, to the small, hopeful face of Ellie watching from the edge of the crowd. She did not need a fancy church or a preacher's words. She did not need a white dress or a crowd of well-wishers. This was her wedding, here under the vast, star-dusted sky, surrounded by the harsh and beautiful land that had tested her and found her worthy, with the quiet carpenter who had seen her true value from the beginning. She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She threw her arms around his neck, and amid the quiet, respectful applause of the town of Dry Creek, Jonah Kane kissed his bride. It was not a passionate, fiery kiss, but one of deep and abiding tenderness, a kiss that tasted of wood smoke and dust and the promise of 1,000 quiet mornings to come. It was a Western kind of happiness, plain, sturdy, and built to last. The wedding feast under the stars was not an end, but a true beginning. Their union wasn't marked by the signing of a register in a dusty church, but by the quiet, unanimous consent of a community that had witnessed their story unfold. In the days and weeks that followed, Maggie found that the silver ring on her finger was not a chain, but a key. It unlocked the last, most stubborn doors of her own heart, allowing her to fully accept the peace she had found, to believe in its permanence. Their life together settled into a rhythm as steady and comforting as a heartbeat. It was a life built not of grand passions, but of 1,000 small, sturdy kindnesses. It was Jonah rising early to build the fire so the cabin was warm when she awoke. It was Maggie packing him a lunch with a piece of fresh-baked bread she knew he loved. It was Ellie, running between them, a bright, happy shuttle weaving their lives together into a single, strong tapestry. The house itself seemed to breathe easier, to settle into its foundations with a new sense of completeness. Jonah built a small, sturdy bookshelf for the primers and storybooks Maggie had acquired. Maggie planted a small kitchen garden just outside the door, and to everyone's surprise, a few stubborn tomato plants and some hardy herbs took root in the unforgiving soil, a small patch of defiant green against the endless brown. Jonah, the silent carpenter, began to open up in the quiet of the evenings. He would tell her stories of his father, of learning the language of the wood, of the hopes he'd had when he first built this small house. He spoke of Sarah, not with the raw, shuddered pain of before, but with a gentle, healing sadness, acknowledging the love they had shared without letting it cast a shadow on the new love he had found. He was a man letting the light back into the long-closed rooms of his heart, and Maggie was the one holding the lantern. One cool autumn afternoon, a year to the day since she had stepped off the train, Maggie found herself alone in the cabin. Jonah was out at a distant ranch, replacing a collapsed roof on a barn, a job that would keep him away until well after dark. Ellie was playing outside, her happy shouts and laughter drifting in through the open door, a constant, reassuring music. The light was soft and golden, the fierce heat of summer having finally given way to a gentle warmth. A sense of profound peace settled over Maggie, a quiet, perfect contentment that she had never believed she would feel again. She took out a pen and a precious sheet of paper from her small writing box. There was a letter she had long needed to write, not one to be sent by any mail train, but a message to be sent out on the currents of memory and love. She dipped the pen in the ink and began, "My dearest mother," she wrote, the familiar words a comfort in themselves. "I am sitting at my kitchen table, outside. The sun is setting on the New Mexico territory. It is not a gentle landscape like the one you knew, not green and soft. It is vast and harsh and beautiful in a way that hurts the eyes. I think, in a way, it is a land that tells the truth. It makes no false promises. And it is my home. I often think of you, and of the woman I was when I left the East. I was a husk, hollowed out by grief and years of quiet desperation. I came west chasing a promise made in a stranger's letters, a foolish, fragile hope that a new life could be purchased and shipped to me like a parcel from a catalog. I was looking for a husband, for a position, for a respectable place to finish out my days. I was looking for a name. I remember the day I arrived as if it were a fever dream. The heat, the dust, the staring faces. I remember the laughter of the young girls who were met by their grooms, and the terrible, echoing silence that surrounded me. I have never felt so small, so utterly invisible, as I did in that moment. No one claimed the bride that day. Mother, I was too old, too plain, too worn by the world. I was a piece of unwanted baggage left on the platform. The man whose promises I had believed, Mr. Thomas Reed, was a lie, a cruel joke played by a weak man for the entertainment of others. But I find I cannot hold any bitterness for him now. His lie was the rough, unpaved road that led me, against all odds, to the truth. And the truth began with the voice of a child. In that moment of my deepest humiliation, when all I wanted was for the earth to swallow me whole, a little girl pointed her finger at me. She was a tiny, fierce thing with eyes the color of a summer sky. And she said, "That's her. That's my mama." It was a ridiculous, impossible thing, a fantasy born in a lonely child's mind. But she said it with such certainty, such absolute conviction, that for a moment, the whole town held its breath. Her father, Jonah, came to fetch her. He is my husband now, and my heart aches with a love for him I cannot properly describe. But then, he was a fortress, a man so locked away in his own grief that he barely seemed to see the world around him. He took me in that first night only because a storm was coming, and because his daughter insisted I was a nuisance, a complication he did not want. But this land, Mother, it has a way of stripping you down to what is essential. A person's character is laid bare here. There is no room for pretense. In the quiet days that followed, we three, this silent, grieving man, his lonely, hopeful daughter, and me, the woman who belonged nowhere, began the slow, awkward work of building a life. And then the fever came and reminded us all how fragile that life is. It was a terrible time. It was like the war all over again, watching the young and the strong fall. But it was in that fire that we were truly forged. I was a nurse again, and it was a comfort to know my hands still remembered how to heal. But when the sickness came for Ellie, and then for me, it was Jonah who held us together. I learned then that his silence was not an absence of feeling, but a vessel for a love so deep and strong it needed no words. He asked me to be his wife in front of the whole town. He did not speak of my beauty or my grace. He spoke of my strength, of my heart. And he gave me a ring he had made himself, from one of his own mother's silver spoons. It is the most beautiful thing I have ever owned. So you see, I found a life here, but it is nothing like the one I came seeking. I did not find it in a letter full of empty promises. I found it in the actions of a good man, in the fierce love of a child, and in the respect of a community that I earned not with a marriage contract, but with my own 2 hands. I have found my place. No one claimed me that day on the train platform. The groom I was promised never came, but one little girl pointed and said I was hers, and she was right. Maggie set down the pen, her heart full. She did not sign the letter. She folded it carefully and tucked it away in the small carved box Jonah had made for her. Some things were not meant to be sent, only to be known. She stood and walked to the door, leaning against the frame. The last of the sun was a fiery orange slash across the horizon, and the vast prairie was bathed in a soft, ethereal glow. In the yard, Ellie was chasing fireflies, her laughter like tiny silver bells in the deepening twilight. Near the newly built barn, Jonah was sliding the heavy door shut for the night, his movements sure and steady. He finished his work and turned, his eyes finding her in the doorway. He raised a hand in a quiet greeting, a gesture of simple, everyday love that was more precious to her than all the poetry in the world. Maggie smiled, a genuine soul-deep smile of pure contentment. She raised her own hand to wave back, and the last ray of sunlight caught the silver ring on her finger. It flashed for a moment, a tiny, brilliant star in the gathering dusk, a perfect, unbroken circle. It was a promise made and a promise kept, a testament to a love that had bloomed, tenacious and beautiful, in the most unlikely of places. She was home. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love for you to comment where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales. Like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.